Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're looking at some massive breaking news today regarding a really complex situation in the Middle East. If you're learning English, or honestly, if you just want to understand global news simply and clearly without all the confusing jargon, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're breaking down a developing story about an agreement between Israel and Hezbollah. We're going to look at the facts, keep things completely neutral, and use really clear, everyday language to help you understand exactly what is happening in the world right now.
But before we get into the heavy details of the news, let's make sure we totally understand the most important word for today's story. That word is truce. A truce is simply an agreement between enemies to stop fighting for a certain period of time. It's absolutely crucial to understand that a truce is not a permanent peace treaty, okay? It's literally just a pause. It's a temporary stop to the violence. Grasping this specific word really helps us understand the reality of what's happening on the ground right now. It is a very fragile pause.
Let's move along and see how this all built. Here's our clear roadmap for today. We'll start with a halt to the fighting, look at the cost of the conflict, explore the global oil connection, explain why the truce is fragile, and finally ask, what happens next? Starting right off with Section 1, a halt to the fighting?
So, according to officials, Israel and the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah have agreed to halt their heavy fighting. Now, halt is just a slightly more formal word for stop. But here is a really interesting detail. Neither Israel nor Hezbollah immediately confirmed this truce themselves to the public. Kind of surprising, right? Instead, the news came from regional and U.S. officials. And this agreement didn't just happen all by itself. Mediators had to step in. A mediator is just someone who helps two fighting sides reach an agreement. In this case, Qatar, the United States, and Iran all work together as mediators to help create this pause in the fighting.
Moving on to Section 2, the cost of the conflict.
We have to talk about the massive human toll this fighting has taken. Right before the news of this truce actually came out, there was a very heavy exchange of fire between the two sides. In that recent exchange alone, reports state that 47 people were killed in Lebanon. And in addition to those lives lost, 97 other people were wounded in Lebanon during that exact same intense period of violence. When we say wounded, it just means they were physically hurt or injured by the attacks.
And this brilliantly, but tragically, illustrates the true scope on both sides of the border. 4 Israeli soldiers were also killed in this heavy exchange of fire. These numbers show us exactly why mediators felt a truce was so urgently needed to stop the terrible loss of life.
And to understand how we even got here, we have to look back just a bit. Hezbollah and Israel went to war shortly after a much wider conflict started in the Middle East. So how did the fighting actually unfold? Well, Hezbollah fired rockets and drones at civilian communities in northern Israel. A drone, as you might know, is an unpiloted flying machine. In response to that, Israel seized large areas of southern Lebanon. Seized simply means they took control of the land using military force. From there, the situation escalated, or grew worse, very, very quickly.
Let's shift gears for Section 3, the global oil connection.
Let's trace this chain reaction, because it's like a giant puzzle. First, the wider conflict begins. Then, as a direct result, Iran effectively closes the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is a massive, incredibly important waterway for international shipping. When it closed, global oil supplies were cut off, which absolutely hurts the entire global economy. Finally, a separate interim, meaning temporary, agreement between the U.S. and Iran reopened the strait. But the heavy fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon was threatening to completely ruin that broader U.S.-Iran agreement. So, as you can see, this local truce is deeply, deeply connected to keeping the whole world's oil flowing smoothly.
And there's another massive global issue tied to this whole shebang. The broader deal also aims to restart diplomatic talks about Iran's nuclear program. But the heavy fighting in Lebanon actually caused a major delay. A very important meeting planned for Friday in Switzerland had to be completely pushed back because of the violence. It just goes to show how local conflicts can literally stop global diplomacy in its tracks. Everything is connected.
Which brings us to Section 4, why the truce is fragile.
So, in English, when we say something is fragile, we mean it can break very easily. And what's really interesting here is how clearly we can see the political gridlock. Gridlock is a great word. It means a situation where absolutely no progress can be made because the two sides disagree completely. On one hand, Hezbollah and Iran demand that Israel must withdraw its forces from Lebanon. They're saying this is a hard, required condition. But on the other hand, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu demands that Israeli forces will stay in southern Lebanon until the threat to them is totally eliminated. You can easily see why a lasting peace is so incredibly difficult when the core demands are completely opposed to each other like this.
To make this reality even clearer, let's look at this direct statement from Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz. He stated that Israeli forces would remain from the Mediterranean coast all the way to the heights of Beaufort. He explicitly said the 200,000 residents who lived in the security zone are not returning. None of them are returning. This firm public statement really proves the deep complexity of the situation and the very real political gridlock blocking any sort of permanent solution.
Finally, Section 5. What happens next?
So the crucial point is this. Despite the news of an agreement, the reality on the ground remains very, very dangerous. Just hours after officials announced the truce to the press, the violence actually continued. A press person in northern Israel reported hearing Israeli artillery fire, which just means heavy, large military guns, along the Lebanese border. Furthermore, a massive explosion was seen erupting inside Lebanon, so the fighting didn't just instantly magically stop the moment the news was announced.
Which leaves us with this final, really important thought. We've explored the pause in fighting, the tragic human cost, the massive global impact on oil, and the deep political gridlock between the two sides. But with bombs still falling hours after the news broke, we have to ask, can an agreement on paper truly bring real peace? Or is this just a brief, fragile pause in a much longer story? Keep paying attention to the news and definitely keep practicing your English by reading updates on this topic because this story is far from over. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer and keep learning.